Okay. So what I want to do today is finish up talking about therapy, focusing on this really kind of interesting issue about whether psychotherapy, particularly these kind of talking therapies that we've been talking about, do they work? And if they do work, why do they work? And so we're going to talk about kind of how to evaluate psychological treatments, randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. We'll talk about some of what some of these studies have shown about, again, why therapy might work for some sort of surprising kinds of reasons. And then at the end, I just want to sum up by talking about three sort of big themes in the course. So, again, let's go through the logistics. Again, your papers, if you have any, are due today in class, at the end of class. As I already told somebody, I sent them back, right? So it's my little way of just getting you to stay here for one more time to listen to me. But again, they're due in class today, no late papers after we leave. It's over again. If you wanted, you can still, there's still time to do extra credit through SONA or through the other extra credit opportunity in this class. So go ahead and do that. Final exam, right? We know this. It's next Thursday, 8 a.m., nice and bright and early. Same, nothing should surprise you about this, right? Same format, same kind of questions. Covers just these two chapters and 3 of the Norton readers. Bring with you, the standard stuff, your ID and everything. And again, the study guide will hopefully be posted later today or by tomorrow at the latest, right? So you have a whole week to go over that, and that's not going to surprise you either. You guys are now realizing that those are just kind of, check-off sheets in a sense. So that's coming. I am going to change my office hours for next week. So again, the exam Thursday morning at 8. So I'm going to have office hours Wednesday from 2 to 3 in my office. So if people want to come in and do that. So there won't be any office hours on Monday, but there will be on Wednesday. I think Jason's having some extra office hours on Wednesday, and you should have been doing reviews and things this week in your discussion section, so hopefully you'll be all prepared and ready for that exam when it comes. Any questions about that, or exam, grading? Good. It's all been clear, I hope. So, let me ask you a couple clicker questions. Get out your clickers. So the question I just want to ask are a couple of simple ones. Do you think psychotherapy works? That is it worth your money to go to a psychologist? Just generally speaking, would you say that you think that psychotherapy works, or it's just a bunch of hooey, right? Yes, A, it works. B, no, you don't think it works, so it's not worth the money. Sparse class here. Well, it's nice I can see how many people are basically here. Okay, let's see. So yes, overwhelmingly, it looks like 85% of you think it works, right? Maybe that's why you're in this class, right? That you want to learn about psychology because you think it's helpful. Here's kind of a related question. So, would you personally ever go to a therapist? So, A, never in a million years, never going to go. Probably not. I might consider it. C, D, yes, I've thought about it. And E, I actually have gone, and it's been helpful. So pick out of those 5 just to get a sense of, would you ever go? Yeah, you could say, sure, it works, but I'd never do it. I don't need it, right? Or, boy, never in a million years, I just don't think it ever works, I probably won't do it. B, C, I might consider it. D, yes, I thought about it. Or E, I've actually done it and it's been helpful for me. Looks like we're... So, I might consider it, looks like the dominant, only 2% of you say you'd never do it in a million years. 21% say probably not, probably, right? You don't know, but maybe you might consider it. Fewer people, and 16% of people have been to somebody and found it helpful. All right. So there's a lot of the interesting thing about, these are fit nicely, I think, with generally with what I want to say. So there's a lot of public perception and stereotypes about psychotherapy. They used to be very negative. The idea that, boy, if you went to a psychologist of some kind, well, then that was something you had to hide. It meant you were crazy somehow. And obviously attitudes have gotten more positive about it. And there's lots of interest in it, lots of TV shows that deal with psychotherapy of various kinds. The American public seems very interested in it. And they did a survey in 1995, a Consumer Reports survey, just to ask people how they felt about it. People who had been to some kind of mental health professional, either a psychologist or a doctor or some support group. And what they found in that survey was that the majority of people who had gone to psychotherapy felt like it helped them, right? Interestingly, the longer they'd been to psychotherapy, the more they thought it helped them, right? So keep in mind some of these things are kind of interesting. The more time they'd invested in it, the more they'd done it, the better they thought it worked. But interestingly, when you compared people who had been to therapy, just been to therapy, just had meds, had both therapy and meds, went to different kinds of people, different kinds of therapies, there was basically no difference. So everybody generally thought it worked and it was helpful for them, right? But it didn't matter that therapy plus meds, no difference. No difference whether people had seen a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a social worker. No difference based on the type of therapy they got. So it was just this sort of general sense of, oh yeah, I went and it seemed to have worked, right? Not that one kind of therapy was better than another or one kind of therapist was better than another, right? Now the thing to remember about this is it isn't a scientific survey, right? Only it had a 4% response rate. So this isn't science, right? But it gives you some sense of how people feel about psychotherapy, right? So they're generally positive about it. And people who have gone to it generally walk away feeling positively toward it. But does it really work? Just because people sort of say that they felt better or they thought that it worked, does that mean that it really does work? Is it worth the time and the money? These are the kind of questions you'd want to know, right? Before I plop down a bunch of money and spend a bunch of time, I want to know whether this is going to be effective. I want to know that about a car mechanic. I want to know that about a doctor. I want to know that about my psychotherapist. Right? And do I want to know what's best? Interesting questions like, oh, gee, we talked about these different kinds of therapy last time. Is one better than the other? Is cognitive therapy really better than behavioral therapy? Are drugs better than therapy? Maybe we should just give people drugs and that really produces all the benefits. These are the kind of questions you'd want to know. And there's this basic philosophy that underlies this idea, which we talk about as being evidence-based medicine or evidence-based policy, right? Evidence-based practice. The idea that if you want to be an educated consumer about these things, and if we want to be an educated society, what we should do is base our decisions on data, on the evidence. So we want to know, it's important to know, what are the data on what kind of therapy works? And the same movement is true in medicine, right? So there's a big push in medicine to make things based on evidence, right? So some doctors just prefer to do certain kinds of treatments. Some doctors may be quicker to do, for example, a cesarean section on a woman who's having a little, issues in labor. Others don't. You want to know, well, what's the data? How do people turn out? If there's some procedure that is it surgery versus some other thing, you want to know how it worked. Not just people's opinions, not just people's anecdotes, which are really rampant in both medicine and psychotherapy. A lot of it has been driven by anecdote and the experience of these therapists, right? But if we really want to make this scientific, we need to have evidence. We need to base our decisions about what kind of treatments to give to people, what kind of treatments to support with health care, insurance, and things like that, where we want to know what really works, right? So there's a big push, right, to figure this out, to get data to figure out what kind of therapy works. And of course, therapy effectiveness is also potentially informative about theory, right? So again, what I talked about last time is that what you think causes things is what you think cures them. So if the thing that if your idea about what the cure is, it is supported, right, that supports your theory. So, it potentially could support psychoanalytic theory or humanistic theory or learning theory, right? So there's another sort of scientific reason to look at therapy effectiveness, right? So part of it is just knowing informing the public about what's good and using healthcare money and things like that effectively. And some of it is potentially people have been interested in doing this because it tests theory as well. So let me ask you how to go about doing this. So here's let me read you this clicker question and take a second to think about it before we do it. So suppose you conduct a study where you studied a large sample of people with a particular kind of psychological disorder, right? You're trying to figure out whether some treatment was effective. You carefully measure their level of disorder at the beginning of the study, then you measure it again after a long course of therapy. It doesn't matter, drugs, talking therapy, combination, whatever, right? If your sample shows significantly lower levels of the disorder after the therapy than they did before the therapy, can you say that that therapy is effective? Right? What do you say about that? Yes or no? If you essentially do a study, you collect data at the beginning on how bad their psychological disorder is, they go through therapy, you collect it at the end, you compare to see whether they've gotten better. Right? Is their level, and if their level of the disorder is lower, if it got better, right, does that mean the treatment's effective? Yes, A. No, B. Next time I teach a class, I'm going to do Jeopardy music during this. Something to fill the empty air in here. Okay. So 67% of you say yes, and 32% of you say no. So we have, more people say yes than no, but we've got a debate here. Who wants to tell me why? Is there somebody who says, go ahead.
You're not comparing the way you're doing therapy to other therapies, so there's no real control group or anything like that, so you can't necessarily prove that that way works better or whatever than others.
So you said no because there's no comparison group of a different therapy, for example, a drug therapy and a talking therapy. So if you found that one of those therapies worked and the other one didn't, after one there was a lower level of disorder at the end, and after the other one there wasn't, you'd be more convinced?
Maybe, but there's also no control group. So it's like, what if they have the disorder and didn't do any of those things? Like didn't take the drugs or go to therapy, like what's the difference there? So there's no...
So did you hear what you said? There's no control group. There's no treatment control. And that's the crucial issue, right? That really comes down to being what you need in these situations. You've got to have some kind of control for just the fact that over time, people might get better, If you just measure pre and post, what you don't really know at the end is, well, if nothing had happened to that person, would they have just gotten better? They were really depressed at the beginning, they're 6 months later, they're less depressed, maybe they just would have gotten less depressed all by themselves. So you need to compare it against that. And it brings up this whole strategy of, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of a treatment? And it brings us to this issue of this really powerful technique that's called a randomized controlled trial or randomized clinical trial. And it's really, RCT is really just an experiment, right? It's just, has the logic of an experiment where the treatment, right, is what you're evaluating against some control group. So there's a bunch of things that have to happen to evaluate these things effectively. First of all, you've got to have some kind of comparison groups to go with, right? And so we told them one of them, the most obvious one, is this no treatment control, right? Because you just don't know whether it was worth it or just the passage of time would have done it. But there's also other issues involved, like the issue of placebo effects, right? That people may just, we know these, and these are well established in medicine and a variety of other situations in which if people's expectations about what a therapy or a drug will do can actually change the physiological outcomes. If you give people a pill under certain circumstances, now it's not this cartoon version that you sometimes see depicted in TV or movies, but there is clearly evidence that if you give people a pill that has no actual active ingredients, no benefits, if people really believe that it makes them better, it can very often make them better, right? That it can actually make the physiological symptoms better, maybe because they actually get better, maybe because people report them better. It's also the case that you get placebo effects. Again, it doesn't just happen with drugs. You can imagine with psychotherapy, it's even more powerful in a sense. Oh yeah, I really think this works. So maybe it does work. And of course, it's not just the individual that's involved. And this is what's been clear in placebo effect research as well, is it's the physician or the healthcare provider's expectations that could be effective too, right? Or so if a doctor thinks that this is an active drug, and then they may very well see the effects that aren't really there, or exaggerate those effects, or maybe give people different kinds of treatments that actually produces those effects. It's very much like those expectancy confirmation processes that we talked about when we were talking about stereotyping and prejudice, right? So you need not just ideally, right, the person has to be blind, and the experimenter or the clinician needs to be blind as well. You can imagine how difficult it is to actually maintain that kind of blindness to things, right? So there's always this effect that, again, it could just be the passage of time. It could just be that everybody expects you to get better, so you get better, right? And you need to try to evaluate those. And so many studies like this have been done where they invest in doing these randomized clinical trials. And again, the first important part is randomization, right? So you have to take, and again, it's a funny situation because you're taking people who have a particular kind of disorder. If you're going to do this right, you need to get very specific. That, gee, I'm going to look for people who are depressed, maybe mildly depressed, maybe severely depressed, but we want to try to get them, right, and some group of people. You got to randomly assign them to conditions. So some people get a treatment group. They get the therapy they're interested in. Another gets a control where maybe they simply wait. There could be multiple controls. There could be multiple treatments that you're looking at, or simply sort of no treatment control group. And then you have a follow-up, right? And then you have to evaluate at the end whether the treatment works better than just waiting, or works better than some other kind of treatment, or works better than some placebic treatment that people are given and trying to convince that it has some therapeutic value when in fact it really doesn't. It's sort of the equivalent of a drug that's just a salt pill or something, right? So you need those kinds of controls. You also, in order to do this kind of science well, right, too, you have to again start with a relatively uniform diagnosis. So you can't, it's really problematic, or it can be problematic if you have some people who are really, really severely depressed, some people just mildly depressed, some people bipolar, right? You don't know whether the treatment, how they're going to get randomly assigned, and it might work on some. If they start off with different conditions, it may be that it's the different condition they start off with that creates some of the differences. It's also the case that you want to have a uniform treatment. When this is the hard part, right? Because there's a real sense in which psychotherapy is an art, right? That people do it differently. Even though two people go in, they're trying to apply behavioral therapy. One person may do it one way, one person may do it another, and you don't know if that's what's causing it, or that just adds noise to the whole thing. Some person may be really, really good at it, and some person may suck. People suck at every job, right? So there, if you have people who don't do it well, right, it causes this noise. It's harder to see any effect if some of the difference is just how different people were at the beginning, or where they're treated differently. So when they do these studies, they have this sort of manualized treatment where they try to get the therapist to deliver the treatment exactly the same way. They have a manual they follow and do it exactly the same way, so that, again, you kind of clean this up and you can evaluate at the end whether people get any better or not. Right. So that's the logic of any kind of experiment, and the logic and the way you would try to evaluate how effective, whether some treatment regimen was effective or not. Again, there's lots of potential problems. So lots of these have been done and invested by different drug companies, and you can imagine people want to evaluate all the drugs that you take and evaluate through randomized clinical trials of various kinds. In psychotherapy, again, there's particular kinds of problems. So first, they really tell us more about what people call efficacy than they do about effectiveness or utility. They sort of, what they really test ultimately is whether theoretically the treatment can work. Right? That's very often what happens in experimental science, right? What you find out is whether something's possible. Not whether in the real world that's the way it happens, right? But whether under these rarefied conditions, in a vacuum, in a sense, or very clear, clean conditions, whether this treatment can work, right? So again, you have an unrepresentative patient population. You have people who are selected to be very, very similar to one another, usually, a very particular kind of level of illness that they want to work on, because that helps, clean up the noise in the experiment. And it's an unrepresentative treatment, right? It's this manualized treatment that's perfect. So you can show, yeah, this treatment really works in this experiment, but in the real world, when people do it in whatever haphazard way they do it, it just doesn't really produce the kind of, it isn't effective in the real world. It doesn't have any real utility. It's only sort of theoretically possible. So that's always an issue, right? So in order to get the clean science to evaluate it, it sometimes makes it unlike the real world. That's a problem we face in social psychology all the time. Lots of psychological experiments, right? In order to get a clean look at things, we've got to kind of take them out of their natural context, right? And then you have to decide, well, gee, does that really tell you about the way it works in the real world? The other huge problem in all this is the power of vested interest, the power of money, right? And not just money, but a lot of it's money, right? So these randomized controlled trials are often done by drug companies, again, and particularly because there's such an emphasis in psychological treatment these days on drugs. So they're the ones that are running these. They're funded, somebody goes out and says, I want to see whether my drug that I just spent millions of dollars developing and could make millions and billions of dollars selling, I want to know if that works. You can imagine what happens when you go into an experiment with that kind of mentality. So what you find is that 89% to 98% of comparative drug trials favor the company's product. Right? So they go in there saying, I want to know whether my drug is the best one. And you know what? I did a science study, and my study's the best study. Or my drug's the best drug. What are the odds? Right? But that's what happens. People, there's this vested interest that tends to pollute a lot of these, that people go in. And again, even more broadly, right, it's not that different for therapy, people may not be making as much money, but they potentially could have money on the line, but they've got scientific prestige, they've got self-esteem involved, right? They are, you know, people usually go into these things saying, I want to show that I really think that behavioral therapy is the best. And so I want to do a study to show that. And my entire life, perhaps, I've been training to do behavioral therapy. That's what I really believe in, and now I'm going to do that, and you get that same thing. So you get this problem with the kind of biased results, right? So one way to get out of, so how do you get out of a situation like that where any study potentially has that kind of bias, right? And it's not that different in other kinds of science. People have different biases, their theory or their perspective they want to support, and so how do you know that their study really defines that? Well, one way to do that is to take advantage of the fact that lots and lots of studies are done. Right? So lots of these clinical trials have been done, and what you can do is figure, well, any one study, the results may be problematic. But if you combine the results of many, many studies, then if there's a pattern across them where one kind of therapy works better than another, or some pattern like that, right, then you're much more confident if it shows up across clinical trials, some of which are funded by one kind of company, some which by another, some by one kind of experimenter with one kind of allegiance to a therapy, and others to others ones, right? And this idea that then we can't, again, and I'm not talking about just looking in a sort of qualitative way across these, right? There's been a real advance over the last 20, 30 years in the development of statistical techniques to combine the results of lots of studies. It's called meta-analysis, right? So the idea is that you can take the results of a bunch of different studies, you can extract out the effects sizes there, how big, and what happened in a study. You combine them all statistically, and you can get a statistical answer that says, oh yeah, across all these studies, behavioral therapy works the best, or drugs work the best, or whatever. And then again, the idea is you get this kind of better picture from looking more broadly, right? And again, even these studies, these meta-analysis, these studies of studies, lots of these have been done because there's so much money, there's so much interest in that, right? So everybody wants to know whether therapy works, and so lots of this kind of research has been done, both individual randomized controlled trials and these meta-analysis. And what the general conclusion, now of course it's always hard to kind of, we could do a meta-analysis and kind of look at all what they say, but generally the conclusions of all of them are something about like this, and it's that psychotherapy does work. So this quote from Smith et al. Meta-analysis, that psychotherapy benefits people of all ages as reliably as schooling educates them, medicine cures them, or business turns a profit. Right? So in that meta-analysis, there was a very clear effect that therapy compared to no treatment controls and whatnot produced effects. Other meta-analyses have produced somewhat more moderate effects and mixed things, but overall I think you get the basic thrust of the answer is that almost all of these meta-analyses show that there's benefits of psychotherapy that equal or surpass comparison groups. And that if there's some conclusion that you kind of pull out at the end, it's really that, if anything, the combination of drugs and talking therapy is particularly effective, right? So seemingly more effective than just drugs or just therapy. And we know that, so that makes sense, right? We talk about this biopsychosocial model that you can look at these psychological disorders and you can see the physiological foundations of them. You can see and draw connections between the levels of the neurochemicals and the psychological state, right? So there really is some kind of physiological basis, and the drugs can address that, but it's much more complicated than that, right? It's not just the physiological state, it's the psychosocial conditions, the trauma, and that is where the therapy helps. So it makes sense in our sort of broad sense of this biopsychosocial model and the diathesis stress idea that drugs and therapies together seem to be about the best. But the picture is a little more complicated than that, right? That these things may not work for the reasons that you imagine. And in fact, there's this sense that you get from the literature that they all seem to work, and that there's a sense of what everybody wins, right? So this is from a quote from Alice in Wonderland, that everyone has won and all must have prizes, right? So that everybody seems to win. So if you look across these different meta-analyses, what you see is a picture in which there's really no difference between the therapy models and their effectiveness. They all produce benefits, but no type seems to be work better than any other, right? So in any single trial, you may get behavioral therapy working better, or cognitive therapy working better, or the drugs working better, but across them all, what you get is they all seem to kind of work. And it doesn't seem to matter much what you do to people. Going to psychotherapy, people report that it makes them feel better. There's evidence on real indicators of psychological mental health, right, that people do get better. But there doesn't seem to be any difference between them. Anything works, right? Or they all work about equally well. They don't always work. They don't produce huge benefits. And there's lots of other problems, right? So people, some of the problems with what these research studies have shown, for example, is that people very often don't finish their course of therapy. People don't finish taking the drugs. They don't continue to take the drugs. There's all sorts of ways that things go off the rails, right? But generally, when you look at it, right, they all seem to work just about as well. Now, that's hard. So how could Freud be right and Rogers be right and the behavioral therapist right and the cognitive people right? How can everybody be right? Ooh. Well, there's a variety of different reasons why this may be the case, right? So one is just the simple idea is that what you're getting is a whole bunch of these kind of allegiance effects, right? So that this trial was run by somebody who was interested in behavioral, this one in cognitive, this one in drug therapy, this one combined, and that whoever's trial it is wins, theirs turns out the best. When you look across all the studies, right, it just looks like they're all kind of effective. Everything just kind of cancels itself out. Right? That's one sort of possibility, maybe the most cynical possibility. Second is that, it's really possible. These studies are really hard to run, right? They're really expensive. So if you think about how you'd have to do, there's a reason why these big drug companies are the ones that can do the randomized controlled trial. If I wanted to do one, it would be very hard, right? I'd need millions of dollars to get the drugs, train the therapists, pay therapists to do this, keep track of people over months and months of time, right, and have enough people, right, to really be able to have the kind of statistical power to figure these things out. And the problem is that many of these studies are probably underpowered, right? They just don't have enough subjects in them. There aren't enough people. It's too hard to find the patients. It's too hard to keep them in therapy. It's too expensive to do these things. So many of these studies just may not have the statistical power to actually tell the difference between therapies, right? So if one therapy is just a little bit better than another one, right, but you don't have enough people, then statistically you can't find the effect, right? You need lots and lots of people to pick up these effects. And so it's possible that the studies just kind of all show, yeah, it generally works, but it's really a sort of a methodological problem that you can't pick out whether one is working better than another. And there's also sort of these theoretical reasons. It may be the case that what this is, so again, the idea is that you do these, another benefit of these treatments, right, is that they test theory. So if you say, I'm humanistic psychologist, I want to test Rogers' theory. If my therapy based on his theory works, that supports mine, right? But it's also, so it's possible, and we don't see that, so that's why it's frustrating, so that no single therapy seems to work the best. But it could be that the models or the therapies all accomplish the same goal via different mechanisms, right? So it could be that, yeah, behavioral therapy works for the reasons it works. Cognitive therapy works for the reason it works. They both work for completely different reasons, and you get similar effects. Or another possibility is this last one, right? That the models accomplish the same goal through the same change mechanisms. That there may be something that they all share in common that's particularly helpful. Right? It's still the case that they may be underpowered and not be able to pick it up, but there's some reason that they all sort of have this effect. And that's what, there's a lot of evidence to support something like this going on. That therapy works, but not quite for the reasons that we think it does. One of the most famous analyses like that is a famous psychiatrist, physician named Jerome Frank, who wrote a series of papers and books during the 60s, 70s, and 80s about this idea of healing and what's the nature of a healing relationship and how it sort of resembles any other kind of persuasion technique. So what Jerome Frank argued, right, was that what's the crucial aspect of any kind of therapeutic relationship is this kind of healer-healee relationship, that you're going to a person who you think you have some belief is going to help you. Now that could be anything from a psychotherapist, neuroscientist, to some tribal healing person and something we make fun of. Oh, that's just a witch doctor, right? But it's the same notion. He says, look, what you see is that people go, they have faith in these people, they have some hope, some belief that these people will help them. And if they have that belief, right, if you think that witch doctor is going to help you, if you think that therapist is going to help you, right, and particularly if you engage in this kind of emotionally charged, confiding relationship with a socially sanctioned healer, right, that's the power that these things have. And it's true of any kind of healing relationship. You're in this healing setting. Again, these other things talk about a rationale, conceptual scheme, or a myth that provides a plausible explanation for the symptoms, prescribes a ritual for resolving them. The ritual is shared with a healer that is believed to be the means to health. So if everybody believes it, right? You go to somebody who you believe is going to give you hope. The culture says, yes, these people are helpful. Right? You get into this relationship where you're working with this person to talk with them, right? There's a reason why you think you're going to get better. You can see it, and the doctor, you believe it, the healer believes it, right? Then people get better. It's this fundamental, what's fundamental to any kind of healing relationship, according to Jerome Frank, is this connection. Right? This connection between a therapist and a client. And if people really believe it, and they may believe it in all those situations, so anything that promotes that kind of connection between these two people is likely to make you better. Psychologically better in particular, right? So it's really an interesting analysis that the reason that they may all work is just because all therapies make you take a step to helping yourself and putting you in this kind of connected relationship with a healer, right? This is a study done by Lambert in 1992 where they looked, again, across a whole bunch of studies to try and figure out to what extent these different elements contributed to therapeutic success. Right, so there were 4 different things that they looked at. Sort of the client, which meant sort of what their level of disorder was when they came in. Were they really sick or were they not very sick? The alliance is the relationship. So that's the quality that the patient said, yeah, I'm really like this person. I'm really connected with them. I really think this is helpful. Their expectancies about whether it was going to work or not when they went in, whether they believed it or not, and then actual elements of the technique where they went through and coded different aspects of the technique and whether it was done well or not. And when you see this is what percentage, this pie chart is kind of how much each of these different factors contributes, right, to the outcome. And what you see that a huge 40% of the outcome is just sort of the client when they come in. They're really sick, right? They don't get as well than as if they feel, if they're a little bit better. So a huge chunk is sort of just the characteristics of clients when they come in. The other big chunk is the alliance. If they're connected with this person, if they rate this as a valuable thing, if they're connected with that therapist, then they get better, right? And the other things do have an effect. The expectancies, whether you just expect it to work, has an effect. Accounts for about 15% of the variance. And the technique itself also is, if it's done well or poorly, it matters, right? But you can see that the other parts of these much more profound things. We've got two questions. One down here.
Yes. So does the Ditto-Bird verdict have any validity?
The Ditto-Bird verdict is just this kind of funny thing that somebody used to describe the essential outcome of all these meta-analyses, which is that everybody's treatment works. So they go in there thinking, we're having a race. We're going to do this. We're going to find out who wins and who doesn't. Guess what? You all win. Therapy works. Doesn't matter what kind. Everybody works, which is sort of basically what the dodo bird said at the end of, in Alice in Wonderland. So that's why they use that term. It's kind of a colorful term. They're saying that this outcome that everything works. That make sense? Well, that's what the data suggests, is they can't. So again, what the data show is that all the therapy, again, across these meta-analyses, what you get is that therapy does seem to work. People seem to get better on sort of standard indicators of mental health. Not just perceive themselves getting better, but they actually do get better. But you can't, the second step in that is, does one kind of therapy work better than another? And there's no evidence that one kind of therapy works better than another, except for some general sense that drugs and therapy work better, right, than just either alone. But basically, it's very hard to look at the data and say, oh yeah, behavioral treatment works, cognitive treatment doesn't, or something. Part of that is because they probably all work, and all work a little bit differently on different kinds of conditions as well. There's certain, behavioral treatments work well on certain kinds of things, right, and cognitive therapies work well on some kinds of things, but not others, right? So you get this sense that overall, everybody kind of works. Another question back here?
Yeah, so does it need to have all four of the categories in order for it to be successful? And does it, matter how much the percentage has to be?
Well, so this is just kind of a way of thinking about if you're going to get better, how much did each of these things contribute to it? Right? So partly is you get certain aspects of you determine whether you're going to get better or not. And that's a big chunk. Another chunk is if you just like the therapist and you guys are connected in this allegiance idea, right? That has another big chunk. Whether you think you're going to get better is another smaller chunk, and how well they actually do it is another chunk. So if you really want therapy to turn out well, right? There you can see the ingredients. You're better off if you happen to have the kind of a variation of the disorder that's particularly treatable, that you have, it's good, that's good. It's good to have a therapist who you really connect with. It's good to have a therapist you really believe in, and it's good to have a good therapist, right? So you always want everything in your favor, right? So it's better to have all those things, right? So therapy actually does have an effect itself, but a lot of it is this kind of psychological stuff, believing in the therapist, believing it's going to work, and being in this connected relationship with the therapist. Right? Oh, I don't know why I keep hitting that. Let me talk about another, so part of it is just being in any kind of connected relationship with somebody, right? But there's another part of it. Anybody remember this slide? This is a kind of a somewhat more provocative idea, but we talked about this at the beginning of or the end of the first, or during that first part of the course in social psychology, this idea of effort justification that comes out of cognitive dissonance theory. So you remember there was this study where they either put people through women through a very severe initiation or a milder initiation to get into this discussion group. And what they found is that people like things better the more they suffer for them. So if the women who were put through a severe initiation to get into the group ended up liking the group better than the people who went through a milder initiation. And this idea of effort justification comes out of cognitive dissonance theory, that if you say, gee, I just freely chose to engage in this initiation. Wow, that was really horrible. They made me read these sexual passages for these men, and it was really uncomfortable. Now they put me in a group where it's just stupid, right? That's a really hard thing to do. I just worked really hard, went through this embarrassing thing to get nothing out of it. So the idea is what people do is they justify the effort. They convince themselves, yeah, that wasn't so bad. This is going to be good. This is great, right? So that, and this has been demonstrated in lots and lots of different ways that if people freely choose to engage in an activity, the more effortful it is, the more they kind of suffer for it, the more they end up liking it, right? So this has been demonstrated in lots of different cases, and the question is, there's people who have thought that this may be part of why psychotherapy works. You freely choose to go and see somebody, pay them a lot of money that you can use for other things sometimes, tell them kind of embarrassing things about yourself, and you do that for a few months, and if you're not getting better, you look kind of stupid. You feel kind of stupid, right? Ah, that didn't work. So the idea is that there's this pressure on people to convince themselves, yeah, this works. And in fact, to actually get better in some ways, just as a way of justifying the effort, right? So that's a really interesting idea, sort of a blanket statement. It's really hard to prove on sort of a general level, but there's been some interesting studies that were done. So here's one that was done by an old professor of mine, a friend, Joel Cooper, who's a researcher in cognitive dissonance, and he thought, well, let me see if I can make this case in terms of psychological treatment. So yeah, the study was done with snake phobics. And what they did is they took people who were afraid of snakes, and the way they gauged that is, people came in and said they were afraid of snakes, and then they would do a classic technique, which is they essentially put a big-ass snake across the room, and they see how close you can get to it, right? And so people, if they're really afraid, they're like the pickle girl, right? They don't want to get anywhere near that, and they can only get 20 feet away before they start to freak out. Some people get 5 feet away. So you figure out kind of what their level of disorder is at the beginning, right? And then he put people through a brief period of some kind of therapy, quote unquote. Half of them were given a choice about which therapy they chose, and so half of them weren't given a choice. Now this is a really tricky kind of manipulation because everybody has to choose the therapy, but they make you feel like you really chose it. So they'll do things like, oh, we really need you to be in therapy A. You have complete choice which one do you want to be in, but we really need you to be in A because there's hardly any people in B, but you can do anything you want. What do you want to do? Right, so they really emphasize choice. Or they say, oh no, you just have to do this one. Right, you're in this study, you do this one. So in one case, they emphasize the choice part of it, which is what cognitive dissonance would say is really the important thing. Freely choosing to do something is what, and then finding out something about it later is what really is the active ingredient here. So half the people were given a choice, or the illusion of choice, and half the people weren't. And then half were given a standard therapy for snake phobics, which is an implosive therapy, essentially again exposure therapy, exposing them repeatedly to snakes, and trying to follow the manual about how you would do that. And half of them simply came in. So the first group did implosive therapy for, I think was an hour twice a week or half an hour twice a week for something like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I actually don't remember the details now. Or they came in and for that exact amount of time and they simply rode on an exercise bike. So they came in, half of them came in on Tuesday, did psychotherapy, half of them came in on Tuesday and just rode a bike. Effortful, right? And then at the end of the study, at the end of this treatment period, they applied the how close can you get to the snake test, right? And this is a very typical way of assessing the effectiveness of therapy for something like phobia, right? So it says, I could get 10 feet away from it before, now I can get 5 feet away from it. I got 5 feet better, right? Or people who can go and touch it, they get 10 feet better, all that. So they have an indicator, and that's the dependent variable, again, is the change in the inches they get to the snake. And what they found at the end of the study is this really fascinating effect. If you look at this, so here, the only thing that matters and how the bigger bars of the treatment's more effective, the only thing that matters is whether they got choice. Freely, it didn't matter at all whether they got something that theoretically actually addressed their phobia, like implosive therapy, or whether they just rode a bike. All that matters is that if you chose to do it, you got better, and if you were forced to do it, you didn't. Right? And again, the two yellow bars aren't significantly different from one another. And in fact, the exercise therapy actually seemed to produce slightly bigger benefits. Right? So again, it's just one little study, but it makes this kind of interesting point, right? That it's, some of the effectiveness of therapy is just the act of choosing. Deciding, I want to get better, I'm going to do this. And then you go and you get involved in something that's effortful, right? Difficult, expensive, and people, in effect, get better as a way of justifying the effort that they invested, right? Now think back to that initial survey that we talked about, that people said, well, the longer they were in treatment, the better they thought it worked. It fits perfectly with this kind of model, right? Now, it doesn't mean that therapy isn't worth it, right? It is, but it's the active choice of choosing to do it and then going through this. And if people it's as if, at least for some psychological problems, a lot of the benefit is just actively trying to do it. And what kind of therapy you get may not matter much. Again, this suggests that the kind of therapy doesn't matter nearly as much as you might imagine, right? So, what this suggests, right, is that a lot of therapy works, a lot of the power of therapy is simply connecting with somebody who cares about you, who you confide in. Right? Some of you may have some kind of intuition about that, right? There's just certain people that are really helpful to talk to. And certain people really can make people feel better, even though they don't have any training. And sometimes you go to a psychologist and they aren't really very helpful, right? You don't connect with them, right? So connecting with somebody really helps. And particularly, again, therapists are trained to sort of establish that kind of relationship, right? So there's a value to it, but a lot of it is just this connected relationship, this choice to get better, right? And that makes therapy effective in and of itself, and then any of the actual therapy effects, whether drugs work or therapy, that may add something onto it, but there's this big benefit, and they all share this single kind of mechanism, right? So, if this is kind of the conclusion of everything, why do we keep worrying about this? Why do we keep trying to collect data like this? Well, first, there's sort of these practical issues, right? Is that you gotta. Just like drugs can't get on the market without randomized controlled trials, therapies, right? They need some evidence in order to get people like insurance companies to endorse them and things. So everybody wants to collect it. There's a culture of evidence-based practice where we want to get the data, right? And so partly people just do it kind of because it's just necessary now. Partly they do it because, again, there's this desire, and I have this sense too, right, that there's got to be something more, right? That some of these therapies probably are right and deal with the actual cause of the problem better than other ones do, right? And that's the idea that that's not true, that all it is establishing, this relationship. That's a tough thing for psychologists to swallow. Right? They want to know. I trained my whole life to do this. I want to know if this works. And I'm going to keep doing research to try and sort this out. Right? So this is a quote from Jerome Frank, that little glory derives from showing that the particular method one has mastered with so much effort may be indistinguishable from methods in its effects. Right? So the idea is, I just trained, spent 6 years of my life, these poor graduate students slogging it out, right? And you find out that I'm full of, right? Doesn't matter. You're training all this effort, just has no. Don't tell them that's true, but that has no. Right? That's a hard thing as well. So people keep doing it. They keep trying. Right? There's this sense that there must be something. Behavioral therapy must work. Cognitive therapy must work. And I think that's good, right? Because that's what drives it. And I think that there's really good reason to think that there's something more out there. right? That we can discover more, and that there really may be some limitations in the research that can be addressed, right? Again, a lot of these studies are underpowered, or they're not designed as well as they could be because there's not enough money. And so it really could be that we just haven't sorted out well enough what therapy works better than another, right? That one actually does, but we just haven't figured it out yet, right? Because this is tough stuff, right? Psychological disorders are really hard to treat because they have all these different causes and everything, right? So there's that. At this point, when you look at, and psychologists have obviously tried really, really hard to evaluate these things, and you get these kind of frustrating conclusions out. Yeah, they all seem to work, and they all seem to work about the same, right? There's a sense that, no, maybe there's a better answer than that, and I think there may very well be, and so it's good. There's sort of a rational reason why we should continue to pursue this kind of research to try and figure out what is the best kind of therapy, because you want your treatments to be based on the best science available, always, right? So we should continue to do this, continue to work at it. There's good evidence. If you're having psychological problems, it's a really good idea to go see somebody, right? It really does help. And again, it may help for some of these more nebulous reasons, right? Just seeking out somebody, making the choice to do it, and finding somebody who you trust and can confide with can really help, right? Okay, any questions about that? Okay, what I want to do just for a few minutes is kind of sum up the class a little bit. So again, the interesting thing about this class is it's split into these three pieces that I think cleave pretty well about social psychology, and about personality psychology, individual differences, and about abnormal and clinical psychology. And there's really a big theme, I think, that comes out of each of those that's deep and profound and important at this general level. The first of those themes corresponds to the first part of the course, and that's the simple idea that people are social, right? That people are deeply connected in this social fabric, and because of that, we're deeply affected by the situations that we inhabit. So again, we talked about this idea that people are really unusual. Humans are these ultra-social creatures. We're hive creatures, right? Our fundamental evolutionary niche is to be together in small groups. That's how we protect ourselves against predators. That's the strategy that we've used to become the sort of dominant animal species on a planet, right? And it defines our nature. We are deeply connected to one another. We're deeply social, right? If you take people, if you make them feel like they're not connected to people, remember those exclusion effects, those social ostracism and exclusion studies, right? It makes people, it strips them away of many of the things that they care about. It lowers their self-esteem, makes them less altruistic, it makes them more aggressive, it makes them actually less intelligent. People, things like, if you separate people from other people, they get really, really sad and unhealthy. Right? We have this deep need to belong. You even see that in the therapy data, right? So this therapeutic alliance, what's really crucial about therapy is the social connection, connecting with another person, right? And that's when we're deeply connected with other people, and what we know and believe is connected, right? So we talked about this idea how deeply social we are, right? That that we think, you have this sense that you just do what you want, right? But that's not true. What you do is really dependent on the people around you. Not just what you do, but what you think. If everybody else thinks something, you tend to think it too. How you feel can be affected by what other people are doing around you, right? So it seeps all the way down. We're deeply connected with other people, and consequently our behavior changes depending on what people we're around. Right? So this idea that understanding what you do is crucially connected to the situation you're in. That's the fundamental social psychological point, right? It flows directly from this idea about people being social, right? I'm connected socially. When we're talking about different situations, we're generally talking about being around different people who have different expectations, right? So the fact that people are social is why their behavior changes from time to time, and the way you behave very differently here than you do at a party, at a football game, and in other sorts of situations. It also stresses, again, the deep importance of culture, which we didn't talk about a whole lot about in this class, but I mean, it really, this is, you know, in social psychology, right, this is the realization. It's actually kind of funny that for years, a field that was interested in people, right, and deeply believed this notion about social, the people that you're around affects what you do, really wasn't interested in culture. Said, oh yeah, you know, we'll study American undergraduates and they're pretty much like everybody else, right? It's really ironic that that was the situation until 20, 30 years ago when people really started to recognize that the culture that you inhabit deeply changes the kind of person you are, right? And so that falls directly out of that notion too. So people are social. In fact, they're ultra-social. And that's an important point to take away because it means that people's situations changes, or their behavior changes with situations. Second, people are different. But change is possible. So in the second part of the course, the real theme, again, is that there are these big individual differences. So you think about social psychology idea, the sort of assumption is that people are pretty much the same, and if you want to know why they behave differently, it's because they're in different situations. They'll behave differently in different situations, right? It sort of treats everybody the same. Of course, the missing element of that is that people aren't all the same. People are different. And that diversity is the hallmark of human experience. You know, people are, it's great that people are different, but God darn it, it's frustrating, right? People have these, you know, people think things that you would never think in a million years. They like things that you would never like in a million years, right? But that's really what people are like. People are dramatically different. They have very different personalities. They're good at different things, right? Some people are smart in lots of different ways. They may be smart in one way and not smart in another. People have different sexual preferences. They have different preferences about everything, and all those things are completely normal, completely within the big theme, right, of psychology, which is that people are different and diversity is just sort of part of the human experience, right? Where that becomes sort of even more ground in, right, is this idea that is another one that social psychology, or that psychology was kind of late to come to, right? That there are the many differences among people have some genetic basis, right? We didn't want to believe that. That wasn't really politically appropriate when I was in graduate school. You had to believe that people were born blank slates and that it was their experience that changed them. There weren't differences between little boys and little girls. There weren't differences, you know, across the races or across different people, right? Particularly intelligence was always this problematic one because it was tied to race in people's thinking, right? But the data were just overwhelming, right? The data are very clear that virtually everything has some genetic basis to it. Virtually everything has some genetic contribution to it, and virtually nothing is completely genetically determined. All right? So modern research has really confirmed that there's a lot of genetic differences. So people are different even genetically, but the crucial part of that is that doesn't mean that things can't change. Right? Just because intelligence has some genetic component to it, that you are born with a certain set of abilities, doesn't mean that that can't be changed, that people can't be made smarter, that education isn't worth it, that education doesn't change things, right? Logically, it doesn't make sense. Right? What certain genetic capabilities do is they set ranges. Right? There are certain things that you may not be able to get to. You know, if you weren't born with the sort of mental abilities of, you know, a brilliant, somebody like Einstein, right? You're not going to get to be Einstein. You can't move people that much, but you can make people much better. And that the environment can also make people worse. right? So you may have, and this is the idea again behind intelligence, the idea behind even personality disorders, right? The idea is that you may have some genetic vulnerability, some diathesis. But whether you become psychologically sick or not really depends on what happens to you, what situations you inhabit. That those can make you, a healthy environment can make you better, an unhealthy environment can set you on a negative trajectory. A good educational environment can get you smart, a poor educational environment will make you not realize your full potential intellectually, right? So just because things might have some genetic basis, almost nothing is completely genetically determined, and the environment still matters. So both people and situations matter. Finally, and this extends right from that, the third theme in the class is that people are complex, right? And that's why psychological science is so hard. Why there's certain things we still don't know about human behavior, why maybe I still have a job. There's still things to find out. Once we find everything out next week, they'll fire me, right? But people are complicated, and that just sort of flows out of what we've said before. I forget whether I actually showed you this sort of idealized formula before when we talked, but this is an idea that was originally tied to a guy named Kurt Lewin, social psychologist, but sort of generally accepted that behavior, if you want to know we're in the science of understanding behavior, and behavior, according to Lewin, was a function of the person times the situation. So if you want to know what anybody was going to do in a situation, you needed to know something about them. Are they introverted, extroverted, what are their individual differences, and then something about the situation that they're in. Right? And then both of those things contribute. If you want to know what somebody does, it's good to know something about what they're like and something about like what the situation's like. But it's even more complicated than that because it's not just a plus sign in there. Right? If I know everything about you and I know everything about the situation, I'll know everything. It's a multiplicative relationship, right? It means that they sort of interact. That depends, and certain people with certain kinds of personality dispositions will respond in one way to a situation, but people with a different kind of personality disposition will respond a different way to that situation. Right? So if you want to understand people, you've got to look at this complicated thing there's a person who has certain expectations and beliefs and abilities, who comes into a situation which has certain pressures and temptations and incentives, and all those things have to be understood at some really rich level in order to predict their behavior. And not just, even that, it sort of ignores the fact that people go through this sort of historical context. They're in situations all the time and that different things have happened to them. It's not just genetically what they bring to the situation, it's their learning history and everything else. So to trying to understand people, you have to take into account things like genetics, biology, evolution, their own life history, culture, and their current situation. Most behaviors that people enact and most traits that you have are multi-causal. That's the thing that makes psychology difficult, right? That people, if I want to know why did you just do that, people very often do things for lots of different reasons, and it's really hard to figure out why. Even in popular culture, we make these kind of mistakes. I think we ask people, well, did this person, somebody goes out and shoots somebody, shoots a Muslim. There was this case in Florida where the guy went out and shot 3 Muslim kids for the parking. Well, did he do it because he's prejudiced? Or was it a parking dispute? I don't know. It's really complicated to answer those questions. It was probably both of those things. It was he probably never would have shot them if it wasn't a parking dispute. But if they were Muslims, he probably, even with the parking dispute, he probably never would have shot them. Right there, in order to understand people, there's these really complicated reasons, and most of the things that happen for multiple reasons, just like we talked about in psychological disorders, in that extreme sense, right? That's why somebody's depressed, why somebody's schizophrenic. It seems to be this sort of complicated, multi-causal story of personality, genetics, environment, all mixed up together. And because people are so complex, human behavior is so complex, right? Psychology, I think, has done a great job. I mean, I'm a huge believer in psychological science as science, and having huge, major, important discoveries about human nature and how to better fulfill the good life for people, and how to make people better. But there's an awful lot left to learn. I try to convey that to you in this class, right? There's certain things you go, I don't know. We don't know that yet. We know a lot, but there's a lot we don't know too. There's a lot we don't know about treating psychological disorders in particular, right? There's a big frontier there, and trying to think about things like why these drugs have the certain effects they do, why don't they get everything better, you know, how do we make those things better, how do we refine them so they only have certain kinds of effects and whatnot, right? So there's a lot left to learn, and changing in human behavior or fixing human behavior is always going to be complicated. If you look at humans individually and societally, you know, we're kind of a mess. You know, things aren't going that well in the world. A lot of people killing each other, a lot of people unhappy, right? We're slogging along, we're trying to do our best, we're doing it, right? We're trying to do it, but there's a lot left to fix. But it's not going to be easy, right? Fixing human behavior, because things are complicated, right? Complicated causes require complicated fixes. And so, again, I'm proud of psychological science for what it's done so far, but there is an awful lot left to learn. There are other classes that it would be great for you to take to learn more about that. And if you're interested in psychology as a field, staying in it, there's going to be an awful lot of exciting stuff coming up in the future that we're going to need to know. So let me finish here with one last clicker question. So are you ready for this class to end and to start easing into your spring break? So no, I wish this quarter would never end, or the Dr. Ditto would come to my house twice a week all break to lecture to me for an hour and 20 minutes, or B, yes. Which choice? And we don't really have to vote on that. But thank you guys. Good luck with the exam. Thanks for being a great class. Thank you very much. Study, study, study. Come to office hours and things that you need. If you have papers, bring them right up here, turn them in. We'll see you guys on Thursday, bright and early, 8 o'clock in the morning, if not before.